We chose this topic because many people fall into roles where they are required to facilitate meetings, and yet so few of us actually receive training and direction on how to do this challenging role well. For those of you who are regular attendees at our webinars, you know we host these webinars to give you timely, valuable information that you can take back to your association and use immediately. These webinars also give us a chance to help you see some of the work that we do, so when you're looking for help, you'll think of us. So let's talk about how to effectively facilitate meetings. What we're going to talk about today is leading from in front and behind. And really what we mean by that is, in some cases, if you are a manager or an executive or a CEO at an association, in the course of your regular duties, you have to facilitate meetings. So we're speaking to you as a facilitator, but we're also speaking to you as a supporter of your volunteers. Sometimes you're going to be in meetings where it's being chaired by a committee chair, or a board meeting where it's being chaired by the board chair. And what you need to do is you need to be prepared to help support them if the meeting looks like it's going off track or it looks like they need some help. So we're going to be talking about leading from both in front and behind. So why does this matter? Well, for a start, meeting productivity is critical. If the association is going to be successful, your committee meetings, your board meetings, your AGMs have to be productive, and they have to be professional. And you need good facilitation to make that happen. It's an important thing for you to make sure that your chairs, people that have been appointed to a committee chair role or a board chair role, that they have professional development so they understand how to be better at their role. It also is an important part of director and volunteer satisfaction. When people are taking their volunteer time to sit through a committee meeting or a board meeting, they're expecting their time to be well used. So they want to see it go effectively, and they want to see professionalism at those meetings. And finally, it's really all about association success. If we can do things in an efficient and an effective manner, keep our volunteers happy, keep our chairs trained and with good professional development, good meeting productivity, we're on the road to success, and we've got a way of maintaining the success we already have. So what we're going to be focusing on today are really the three kinds of meetings you're likely to find yourself in: board meetings, AGMs or other member meetings, and also committee meetings. The topics we're going to talk about on our agenda are: what is the facilitator role? What do we mean by facilitator? We're going to start by telling you about some things you can do before you actually start the meetings, things you can do to prepare for a really great facilitated event. We're going to talk about how you can support the chair if you're not in the chair's role. And then we're going to talk about what you're actually doing in the meeting. What are the logistics of the meeting? What are the outcomes? And we're going to be giving you some tips and some phrases that you can use to help keep meetings on track and stop yourselves going down a rabbit hole or ending up in a difficult situation that it's going to be hard to get yourself out of. So the way you know that a meeting has been well facilitated is the meeting ends on time, the decisions you need have been made, and your participants are fully vested in the decisions that have been made. So what I'd like to do is, Asif, what are your thoughts about what is a facilitator? I mean, when we talk about that role, what are you thinking of? What do you think is kind of the minimum that a facilitator needs to accommodate in order to have done their job?
Yeah, thanks, Erin, and welcome everybody to the webinar. By definition, a facilitator is a person who helps a group of people to work together better, understand their common objectives, and plan how to achieve those objectives during meetings or discussions. And in doing so, the facilitator remains neutral, meaning they do not take a particular position in this discussion. So that's by way of a definition. That's how you would define a facilitator.
Yeah, I like the way you talked about, knowing your audience as well, too. And I think it's really important that if you are bringing in an external facilitator, for example, make sure they're well briefed on who's in the room and what their backstory is as well, too.
Exactly. So that is also important to know who you're addressing and how that all works out and how that fits into the big picture. Now, when it comes to the facilitators themselves, at a minimum, what you need to know or do are the three things that are on the slide. A, who makes progress easier, runs a meeting efficiently and effectively, and helps the group reach an agreement for which everyone takes responsibility. And that's imperative.
Yeah, I think that last bit of that phrase is really important. You know, as a facilitator, you can bulldoze through to an outcome. But what happens then is you've got people in the room that didn't really agree with that outcome. So this is key, for which everyone takes responsibility. We need to make sure as a facilitator that once that agreement has been reached, that decision has been made, that everybody has accepted it, at least they're on board with it, and they're not just sitting there afraid to say anything. So that's critical, that everybody is on board and vested in the outcome.
Absolutely.
Now, that's the facilitator, right? I mean, that's the minimum we're expecting from a facilitator.
Exactly.
But what's the difference between your sort of garden variety facilitator and a really great facilitator?
So I think the one thing that comes to mind when you talk about, the expert in the field, one thing to note, and I guess all of us, including our guests here today, have sat through different meetings, whether it be a board or committee or any staff meeting. What we always need to have in mind is the goal or the end point in mind, which kind of drives us through that conversation to get to that point. So we need to know our starting point, obviously, and our end point. If that is in your view, then I guess that makes that journey easy and with a purpose, and you come out with the objective that you had in mind. Because at times, and I say that because at times we have always all been in a meeting and in conversations where things have derailed, and before you know, the meeting is almost over and we have not reached a decision. So to avoid that sort of a situation, it's imperative that you have that end goal in mind.
That's a really good point, Asif. And I would add to that, you need to have the end goal of the entire meeting in mind, and also for each agenda item as well, too. You know, you don't want, as a facilitator, to move on to the next agenda item if we haven't clearly got what we were looking for in the previous one.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's the same breath, because when you talk about that end game, it's also imperative to have that foresight as the discussion might get off track and hence run out of time. So if you are a facilitator who knows your objective, you can redirect that conversation and facilitate the way for a decision to be made on a topic. And to be able to do that is, I think, what makes or differentiate between a regular facilitator from a good facilitator.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And one thing that I've noticed a lot in board meetings in our sector is you can see there's a point that says respects and manages controversy. You know, you're not with a great facilitator, they are respecting and managing controversy, not because it's a bad thing to have controversy. And I think sometimes we might lose track of this, that everybody agrees. And so there really is no debate and no meaningful discussion. And maybe it's because we're all in the same industry or the same profession or whatever. But as a facilitator, if you're not hearing both sides of the debate, then a really great facilitator is going to say, you know, it looks like all of us agree that the answer should be yes here. Could someone please at least state the no side so that we can genuinely say we've heard both sides of the story? And I think that's something that in board meetings and committee meetings, I often see just doesn't happen. And it can be very healthy to bring that up and make sure that everybody's thought about the things that maybe it didn't occur to them to think about when they were in the discussion.
Yeah, I mean, Erin, as you just mentioned about respect and managing controversy, along the same lines, I think that goes when we say that, you know, how do you stimulate discussion? And this is exactly what it is. There are people that are sitting on the sidelines and not being engaged or what have you. And this is certainly a way, when you talk about respect, this is a way to engage those people into the conversation and get their feedback also, because you just don't want to ramrod an idea. You have to have the idea of by and large, and that's what also makes a good facilitation of meeting.
Exactly. So those are the differences between your average facilitator and a really great facilitator. And keep in mind, if your chairs that you are helping to support are doing any of these great facilitation type of things, make sure that you give them positive feedback after the meeting saying, I really like the way you did that. Make sure that you're constantly giving them positive support and feedback and supporting them when things look like they might be going a little bit sideways.
And also, before we move on, Erin, I just wanted to highlight the last point that we have on the slide is on time. It's critical that we keep the pace of the meeting on track, because having a meeting, go in different directions is very easy, but to manage it and to start and end it on time is also highly critical and one of the skill sets of a great facilitator.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And that takes practice. A really great facilitator will say, oh, I've got 5 minutes for this agenda item. I'm now at minute 6 or 7. Can I make up time on the next one or can I not? And that takes practice to be able to do that. But these days, a lot of us are going from back-to-back meetings. We don't even have 5 minutes to go overtime, or we've got to cut off. And then all of a sudden you find yourself in a situation where you've lost half your team and you aren't able to make a decision. So let's talk about board meetings. I'm going to describe how we see board meetings and committee meetings and how that segues back into the facilitator role. In a board meeting, of course, is somewhat more formal typically than a committee meeting, but they are both structured, agenda-driven events. You don't want to go into any meeting unless there's an agenda for that meeting, even if it's only a single topic. An agenda helps people to understand why they're there, to keep on time, and to understand what is appropriate to discuss in this meeting and not appropriate. So in a board meeting, as in a committee meeting, it's going to be there to share information. It's going to be there to ask questions, and it's going to be there for discussion or debate. Now, at a board meeting, if you're going to go to a vote especially, you want to make sure you've got that debate and you are hearing both sides of the equation, because you don't want to ever go to a vote where one side of the argument just wasn't shared. In a board meeting, you are going to be making decisions, and those decisions might be just decisions that get recorded, or they might be votes that are actually recorded in the minutes and you're going to be paying attention to those going forward as a decision the board has actually made and voted on. In both cases, you want to make sure you're recording task management, because if you come out of your meetings, there are going to be tasks that come up, and if you don't keep track of those, things don't get done. So part of what you're doing when you're doing those meetings is making sure that you're clear on, okay, I understand that we need to do this, and so has volunteered to do that, or the staff is going to do that. Part of what the facilitator is doing there is just making sure that for the minutes, the tasks have been recorded. Also, high-level direction is what's needed at a board meeting. What the board is there to do is to provide strategic direction. So that's something you're going to see in a board meeting, but not in a committee meeting. The difference with a committee meeting is, instead of making a decision, you are making a recommendation. So you are making, typically, it's going to be a recommendation to the board, or it's going to be a recommendation to the CEO. So if you happen to be a board committee, and let's say that you are the nominations committee, by the time you've done your work, you should have a slate of nominees that you're prepared to suggest to the board, so the board can vote in the slate of directors before it goes to the member vote. You, as the nominations committee, are not deciding who's going to be on the slate. You're making a recommendation. Same thing if you're the awards committee, you are making a recommendation on who should be receiving the awards. So in very, very rare cases, unless it's been specifically and explicitly delegated to a committee, you're not there for recommendations. So it's important that the chair understands that we're not here to vote. We are only here to make recommendations. And then task management, of course, is absolutely critical as well. So again, as a facilitator, you need to make sure, okay, I think I heard a task there. Who's going to be doing that? Let's make sure that it's recorded. Or if we've got to find somebody to do it later, who's going to find that person? Now, I do want to talk about what to avoid, because that is really critical as a facilitator. We need to make sure that we are clear on what is acceptable to happen in the meeting and what is not acceptable to happen in the meeting. Now, I think the first point to start off with is what to avoid is not being clear. So at the start of every meeting, unless it's very routine and everybody gets it and there's no new people at the table, we want to be clear on what the deliverables are for the meeting. By the end of this meeting, we need to have a vote in several areas, or we need to have done a full review of our strategic plan, or we need to have a date for our next members meeting and we need to have speakers. So be clear, by the time we leave this room or this call, this is what we need from you, so that people are very clear on that. It also helps, as the facilitator, it helps you to bring them back again, because if you've been very clear at the beginning, this is what we must accomplish, and you're a third of the way through the meeting and you're not even close to that, you can say, by the way, remember I said this is what we need to accomplish? We need to get back on track here. Now, if there are ground rules, certain formalities to how the meeting's going to run, you want to make sure that people are using the raise your hand feature. Make sure you're clear on that right at the beginning. You also want to avoid any appearance as a facilitator that you're not neutral. Now, this can be a challenge. When you're the chair of the board, you're the chair of a committee, you've got an opinion. I mean, that's one of the reasons that you're there. It's one of the reasons people want you as a volunteer. But when you're steering and maneuvering a discussion, you want to make sure that it doesn't look like you're siding with one side of the discussion or the other side of the discussion. You're going to vote, probably. That's probably part of your role. But make sure the discussion has been fully completed and you've heard both sides. Because if you're not neutral, it's really almost impossible for you to do an effective job of facilitation and arbitration, because you're going to be seen by one party as being kind of against them. The other thing you don't want to do is to dominate the conversation. Remember, you are mostly there to listen, to reiterate, and to steer, not to dominate the conversation. Make sure that you're the last to speak on a topic. Also think about allowing others to dominate. If you're letting other people dominate the conversation, then that means that not everyone is participating, and that's not what you're looking for either. So make sure that no one is sort of taking over the conversation. And then finally, and the most obvious thing that we want from a facilitator, is making sure that the meeting doesn't actually get off track. So what I'd like to do now is, Asif, could you kind of take us through what we need to be thinking about if we're not the chair in the meeting, but we are a staffer and we are trying to support the facilitator and help them to keep out of trouble?
Yeah, thanks, Erin. So the question is, who is the facilitator? That could be anybody at a meeting, just depends on which meeting it is. But for the purposes of our discussion today, we have outlined 3 scenarios whereby we'll identify who the facilitator is for these 3 particular scenarios. So I'll start off with the board. So depending on the title of a board chair, it could be the president or the chair. That is the person who actually or usually facilitates the board meetings, as you know, with the help of the ED or the CEO as the support person. The committee chair could be either a board or a non-board member facilitating the meetings, again, with the help of the CEO or ED or some other staff member. And obviously there's the third category, which is the CEO or other staffers. As we all know, there are some operating committees that are chaired by the ED, the CEO, or in some event, it's either the CEO is on a meeting with a stakeholder, perhaps. So those are the scenarios where you actually are the facilitator and doing your role as the facilitator. So what do you actually do? Like, what's your role? So in this case, say you are supporting the chair of the board. How do you do that? So regardless of wherever you fall on the support spectrum, your job is to alert and prompt the chair of anything that you might see based on your experience as a hindrance in the proper proceeding of the meeting. Your intent should be never to take over, as Erin just referred to. So how do you do that, being subtle about it? Now let's look at an example. You're at a board meeting where the board chair for this discussion, I would say, let's name him Rob, is new in his role. The meeting is supposed to start at 11 a.m. and it's a virtual meeting. Most of the members are in, with the exception of one, meaning there is quorum. They're engaged in a conversation. By now it's 5 after, and the chair hasn't called the meeting to order. In your role as a support person, you could prompt the chair by saying something to the effect of, I just want to be mindful of everyone's time. It's already 5 after. Should we get started, Rob? So you see the distinction here. You're just trying to prompt Rob because he's engaged in that discussion, and you don't want to be rude. You want to be respectful, yet you want to get the ball rolling, and you say that to make sort of a headway into what you want to do, which is to start the meeting. Other things that you could say is when things are not very clear. For instance, while the meeting has started now, and you know they're discussing a topic and whatnot, and you realize that it's almost the allotted time is like say 10 minutes, and it's already past 15, and the discussion keeps going, and there is no call to action. And in that vein, what you could do is you could say, my apologies for the interruption. Could you please state what the decision was? So in order to come to a decision, because you know that there has not been a decision made, you want to prompt them and direct them in a direction that you're saying that please make a decision. In other words, the chair might have forgotten or doesn't have the appropriate experience. You're facilitating the facilitator to get to that decision. The other thing that you could see when, or you could say, we have got this line at the very bottom where it says, I believe Claire knows this topic well, and you're wondering as to what that is. You could also prompt the chair when you see a lack of engagement from the other board members. For instance, if there's a discussion on, say, advocacy, and you know for a fact that Claire is the head of GR at her organization, you could say something like, I believe that Claire has a lot of knowledge on GR. So Claire, what's your thought on this? That way you prompt that discussion and you bring Claire into the discussion. So that way, again, if the chair might not have that background about Claire, you very subtly come in, you lead that discussion on, and again, throw it back to the chair to continue with that discussion. Now, before you start supporting the chair, there are some things that is critical, and one being, it's very important that we train the facilitator, whoever that is, especially if they're new in their role. It's advised that they receive a proper training, as it helps to hone their skills. Facilitation itself merely is not an add-on to a leader's repertoire. It forms the foundation of effective leadership, enables us to guide teams and their entire organization towards their goals while optimizing the meeting process for the most productive outcome and fostering a culture of collaboration, identify and resolve problems, learn, make decisions, and handle conflict. In that way, I would say Zzeem offers a very comprehensive training, facilitator training course. If you have interest and you want to know more about it, please let us know and we can provide you with that information. So once we get that out of the way, that now we know that the facilitator is well trained, what do we do then? What's very, very critical in this whole process is the agenda, as we all know. So once we say that, okay, once the agenda, once it comes to the point that we're preparing the agenda, how I usually do is I create a draft agenda myself based on all the items that I think that I have discussed over the course of whatever, because our board meetings are quarterly. So what we do is we have got a 3-month span in between which the discussion items could be many. And I also have a running list, items list that I sort of dump things in. So I go back to that list and grab all my agenda items and put it in and create that draft and send it off to my president and say, here is the draft, what do you think? So that's more for their input and feedback. Always remember that having skin in the game is important for optimal performance, as we know. So getting their feedback and facilitating that process of having a discussion around the whole agenda item is important. So you start that before the meeting starts through the agenda planning process. Briefing before meeting. I can't stress the importance of briefing the chair ahead of a meeting in order to raise any red flags or underline the items that absolutely needs to be made a decision on. By way of best practices, I always note beside the agenda item the purpose. For instance, say vote required, or just for discussion purposes only, so that both the facilitator and the attendees know what it is about and what the desired outcome is. So that's, as I say, it's by way of best practices that should be maintained, because that helps run the meetings better. Along with that, it's the other thing that I usually, and I shouldn't say usually, but I always do, is to assign a time for each agenda item, so that we know, based on its importance, you need to assign a time so that we know that there is certain time allotted to it, and you don't have a free-for-all. So there's a start and an end time, and by which we have to have a decision made. So that's also very critical. We also don't want the chair to be caught off guard. Hence, they need to be apprised of issues in particular which are contentious in nature, and also by way of giving them a background. If there are any contentious issues, they need to be provided with the proper background in terms of why that happened, what was the outcome, or if there was an outcome, excuse me, or not, and what needs to be done if certain type of questions come up. So these are critical for the facilitator to be made aware of.
Asif, do you feel that every meeting you need to have a briefing ahead of time with the chair, or do you just feel it's for board meetings, or when would you decide to brief the chair or not to brief the chair?
So that's a great question, Erin. I feel there are certain meetings that prior to which you must have a briefing with the chair. For instance, at an AGM, you must have a sit down with the chair and go over the questions that might come up, and also giving them as much background as possible. For instance, like on some of the more controversial issues that could come up at an AGM could be around the finances. So be well prepared for that, both with the chair and whoever, maybe in this case, the person actually addressing it is your finance person, your treasurer. So not only is the facilitator the chair in this matter, but whoever is actually addressing any of the agenda items, they should all be prepped. So I want to preface on that as well, to say that it's important that whoever is in that conversation at the AGM, they all need to be prepped. And along with the AGM, I would say some board meetings are also very, I would say at times have the potential of having a landmine under it. Those for sure need to be addressed. And I would say, as a rule of thumb, all board meetings, you should always do a briefing before that, even just to say, okay, you're addressing this, and I'm taking on this item. Are you fine? If it doesn't always have to be, contentious issues, that's why we do briefings, but just to be able to run the meeting with a good flow, it's important to have that. And not so much for committee meetings, unless there is an issue. I would say committee meetings are fine, even if you don't take that much time to prep the chair.
Yeah, that's a good point, Asif. AGMs, I haven't seen many AGMs go off the rails, but I've seen a few, and that is probably the thing that I am the most scared of, going into an AGM and not knowing what you might expect. And I think that we've both learned over the years that the more preparing you do for the AGM, the less chance of the chair or the treasurer or whoever being caught flat-footed. So I think, particularly at the AGM, one of the things that we're always looking to avoid is something that is forcing a member vote on something that the members aren't, sufficiently informed on to make a decision. So doing that briefing ahead of time, I think, makes everybody a lot more comfortable and gives them the tools they need to manage it if there's a situation where you've got a member that is kind of taking things into their own hands.
Yeah, and I also want to highlight and sort of some of the issues, potential issues that might come up, and why you should be very off of an AGM. And through experience, I can tell you that, and what I had to deal with in some of my AGMs is, at least in one, excuse me, where a member kind of stands up and say, you know what, I want to nominate myself for a board position. And what do? Do you gag that person and say, no, please sit down? That's not allowed. You can't. Even if you want to, you can't. So in certain circumstances, what do you do? For this example, I would say, in what I had done is that you acknowledge, or what I had asked the chair to do was to, and I'm thankful that we actually prepped this question ahead of time because we knew this might come up. So the response was, acknowledge it, that great, that we're excited that you want to be a part of our board, but we have a nominations process. We would highly encourage you to follow that process for next year, and go through the process, and we'll be more than happy to cater for next year. So the bottom line here is, we don't want the board to be pushed against the wall and try to make a on-the-spot decision, because that's not good for anybody. So we need to avoid that, and we have to prep the chair and the facilitator to have that end goal in mind, that we don't, whatever happens, we don't want to make a decision on the spot unless it's already, the board has already had a chance to discuss the matter ahead of time, but nothing that could catch that person off guard could be made a decision on the spot. And do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, I think those are really good points. And I guess I should also throw into the mix, a lot depends on your bylaws. There are some things that can be raised from the floor at an AGM, and you need to be prepared for those. If it doesn't prohibit them in your bylaws, then you need to be prepared for that possibility. And if your bylaws and you've got policies that state how the nominations process works, that's great, because then you can just share, by the way, here's the policy, this was what was followed. If you want a copy, we're happy to share it with you. So, and like Asif says, we don't want to shut people down or make it sound like we're trying to silence them. But at the same time, we need to make sure that due process is being followed. So Asif, you made some references to what we need to be thinking about on the agenda, so I'm not going to repeat them. But like Asif said, you want to make sure that for every agenda item, there's a specific time associated to how much time the facilitator is going to spend on that. And what is the outcome? Are we going to a vote? Is it just for information? I like having that right on the agenda, so it's very, very clear. The more information you can give the facilitator about each agenda item, the better job that they're going to be able to do. I also find it really helpful, if there's going to be a vote, give them a draft motion so that it's right there in the board package, and you don't have to spend time kind of trying to wordsmith what that draft motion might be. Now, I have heard the comment made, and it's a legitimate one. Well, I don't want to have a draft motion in the board package because that presumes that the board is going to vote a certain way, and it's going to influence them to vote a certain way. Fair comment, and you don't have to do it like that. If, let's say that the vote is voting on the slate of directors to be presented at the AGM. Your draft motion can say, motion to accept as presented / as revised the slate of directors. So whether the board chooses to accept it as revised or as presented, you've got the language there. You just have to pick one or the other. I like doing that because it really saves time. Asif talked about being very specific about what time you're actually having on the agenda, and make sure that you're thoughtful about that. If this is something that really is important and it deserves a lot of time, then give it the time it needs. Don't try to pack the agenda and whistle through something that really needs a lot of board attention. Make sure you've got enough time for it. And similarly, where it's information only, 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes at the outside, you're just passing along the information and you're not there to discuss it or debate it. It's just, this is for the board. And Asif also told you about keeping a running list of agenda items, particularly for board meetings. So by the time you actually get to the time to start planning the agenda, you know all of the things that have been raised in previous meetings, committee meetings, etc. You know what needs to go on that agenda. Now, we wanted to talk also about what happens when you're actually in the meeting. What should the facilitator be doing? What can you do in order to provide support? Ground rules are important. Maybe at the AGM, it's important to set ground rules. At board meetings, it might be important to set ground rules. You figure out what is really needed for you as a group. But at a minimum, you might want to talk about, whether you want people to raise their hands in order to speak. That sure makes it a lot easier for the facilitator. And when you do have multiple people raising their hands at once, a good facilitator will say, okay, I see your 3 hands. I know who you are. Let's start with so-and-so, then we'll come back to you. I'll talk a little bit about that first come, first serve order in a minute too. If you are in a situation where, unfortunately, civility isn't always observed at these meetings, make sure you define explicitly what civility means. And if you do that at the very beginning, and then you have an outbreak of incivility partway through the board meeting, you can say, remember what we talked about civility at the beginning of the board meeting? This is an example. And then you're drawing it back to the outcomes that you talked about at the beginning. Make sure that as the facilitator, you're using people's names and you're making eye contact with them. You want to be able to make a connection with the people that you are trying to help facilitate. Because remember, you are their servant. You are there to help facilitate to an outcome from the agenda. Now, I want to talk about this putting your hand up thing. Sometimes you've got people that will do a great job of putting their hand up, but they're still dominating the conversation. Okay, Erin, you've already talked for 10 minutes on the last topic. Now you got your hand up again. As a facilitator, you can say, great, Erin, I see your hand up. I also see that, Asif and Bob have their hands up as well too. We haven't heard from Bob yet. So maybe we can start with Bob and then work our way back to you. So you don't have to give them first call because they got their hand up first. Think about who else has not contributed and who has their hands up. And if you got people that are just putting their hands up and they've already done a lot of talking on this topic already, don't be afraid to say, okay, I see the 2 of you have your hands up. Great, please hold that thought. But I know we haven't heard from Claire yet, and I know she knows a lot about this topic. So Claire, could you pipe in before we go back to the other 2? I also want to share, as a facilitator, don't be afraid of silence. If you ask a question and say, okay, who wants to kick off the topic, and nobody wants to say anything, just sit there, give them a chance. It's amazing that a lot of us as human beings, we do fear silence. And even though we would rather sit back and say nothing, if the silence goes on for long enough, most of us feel compelled to open our mouths. So if you're finding you're not getting enough engagement, don't be afraid to use silence in order to get engagement. Also encourage you to make sure that you are referring to briefing materials. As the facilitator, you should know what was in the briefing package that was sent out to everybody, especially for a board meeting. And when somebody's got a question, you can say, okay, we're going to be talking about this. We've got a policy around this. It's included in the board package. It's on page 7. Please make sure you're referring to this as we're talking about this particular agenda item. So especially when you're wanting them to vote or discuss something that they really need to have read the package, make sure you're saying, by the way, for this agenda item, we're going to be voting on changes to bylaws. So here's the summary of the changes to the bylaws that we've got. Please make sure that's in front of you while we're having this discussion. So those are just some things to think about while you're on site as a facilitator, and maybe what you can do to support as well too. Again, if you're seeing a lot of dominant people at the board meeting and the chair is not bringing other people out, you can use some of the phrases that Asif came up to help with that. Now, what I'd like to do is to hand it over to Asif to talk about things that we often don't really want to talk about, but unfortunately, Incivility, bullying, and even outright abuse, unfortunately, does happen in board meetings. And often it catches the chair flat-footed and they're just, their eyes are bugged out and they don't know what to do. So Asif, what are your thoughts on that? I know we've all been through it.
Yeah, and you're right, Erin. And by way of incivility, there could be a varying degree of incivility, bullying, and abuse, as we all know. Some could be overt, some covert. How do you identify them? It's not as cut and dried, right? So we have to just kind of see it when it comes and kind of manage it from there onwards. Excuse me. We've outlined 3 levels of incivility, bullying, and abuse for the purposes of this discussion. The level 1, would be ignoring the chair. You're talking over participants. A more severe level would be when it's getting more personal attacks and such. So that's a higher level. And the highest level, if you want to call it, is going to be the timeout, where you say, okay, I'm done with it. I don't want to deal with it. You have to stop right now, or this meeting is over. So given those scenarios, and before we actually get these actions in play, we need to have a strategy to counter them, right? So those strategies could involve, say, and that's something that I actually follow with my president, is to have this ground rule to do to have a direct messaging sort of a way whereby to inform him if there is an issue. So for instance, we have always agreed, and we all keep agreeing, that keep your phone by your side, and if there's something, I'll text you. So that's my way of doing it. And not necessarily that might be a way or the best way for you to manage that. But the bottom line here is there should be a way, established communication where you could get the attention of your chair or the facilitator and say, hey, this is what it is, and this is what we need to get out of, and this is how we should do it. And be also mindful that the call to action is to have a look at the message, not to actually start replying it, because then in that case, it obviously people get to see it, and that's not a very good an effective way of communication. If the person just has a look at the message and then goes in that direction, that's all we need. By this character management, and that's something, again, while you're prepping, you're doing the prep and briefing, you could say, I feel Rick at the last meeting had this huge issue with the finances. Maybe he'll have something up his sleeve this time around. So just be cautious. So that's by way of character management. You could characterize him as he has been a troublemaker in the past. He could do that again. Just be mindful of that. And then the trigger is something that could be a hot button, right? It could be, again, the event that's upcoming. That is contentious. So you have to have some answers ready already. Like why are the sponsors not on board yet? The meeting is 3 months out, and we don't have any sponsors. What kind of answers do we have for that? Let's sit down and discuss as to how we would respond to that. So those are kind of the issues that perhaps come up and you discuss. And do you want to add something to this?
Yeah, I think that idea of direct messaging can be really, really helpful. And especially if it's a virtual meeting where nobody can actually see, who's texting or who's looking or anything along those lines, I think that can be really effective, as long as your chair is the kind of person that is kind of really alert to their phone, that they're going to see it. If they're the kind of person that just gets right into it and they're totally focused on the meeting and they don't see anything that happens on their phone, then you're going to have to come up with something else. Equally, if it's in a board meeting, that can get more tricky, because you don't want your board members to be sitting there texting for other purposes. But if the CEO is texting the chair, then maybe that they're kind of thinking, well, why is it that they're allowed to text and I'm not? So like Asif said, you've got to figure out, as the support person with the chair there, committee chair or board chair, what's going to work well for you. So let's talk about our level 1 support. Asif,
Yes.
we're talking about level 1, and I think we can call her maybe talkative Trisha. She's not trying to be a pain in the butt. She's not trying to stop people from talking, but she's just not following the ground rules. So
exactly,
how are we going to deal with that?
Yeah. So as you might remember, our level 1 was ignoring the chair and talking over other participants. So here, talkative Trisha is not trying to be rude, but she's not giving anyone else a chance to speak either. She's talking over them and ignoring the chair. So what do you do in that case? You could use some of these lines, and hopefully that's going to work. But be mindful of one thing. It's, as we always have heard, that it's not what you say is important, it's how you say it. So you need to be mindful. And I always say in a committee or a board meeting, the volunteers are kind of lifeline, and they are critical for each association, and they're doing something from the goodness of their heart. So if we have to be extra cautious, we need to handle them with kid gloves. So and by way of doing that, we have to be extra cautious. So a smile, anything that you say with a smile is really helpful, and that takes off that edge of that comment. So you could say, I can see there's a lot of passion about this, and you can continue, but can we have somebody else also chime in? I mean, that way you can divert the direction to somebody else. You could also say something to the effect of, it's important that everyone else has a chance to speak, right? Or if there's a situation where you feel that you don't need to give somebody else the floor, you can directly say, I believe Sunil has the floor now, and let's hear him speak. And this is something that and I would say Erin actually does that in most of her meetings when she's helping the facilitator, is what I think I hear you say. And that is something, is just to sort of kind of re-emphasize on well, especially if you're making notes of something and you're not quite sure as to if I got that correctly, just for the minutes purposes, you could say, what I think I hear you saying is this, is that correct? And they can say yes or no either way. So that way, that's a great way of sort of clarifying what the intent was, so that we know what the intent and purposes were. Erin, do you want to say anything?
That's a really good point. Sometimes I also find is, somebody has said something, but it's just not clear what they meant or what the point was. Maybe somebody is passionately disagreeing with something, but they don't give an alternative, or they don't explain why. You can say, what I think I hear you saying is you are in passionate disagreement with going down this path. Is that the case? And then at least you've got clarity on that. And then maybe you can say, so now let's explain why, so we can understand what your challenges are. Now with level 2, to me, this is the most difficult one of all. And I want to use an example here of Sneaky Stephen. And what we've got here is it's clearly bullying, but Stephen isn't actually saying anything that you can hang your hat on. This Stephen would be the kind of guy that would, if he was ever called on something, he would say, oh, I was just joking, I didn't mean that. Or, well, I never said anything offensive, I just said, what are you doing about such and such? Everybody in the room knows it's a bully, but you can't really catch them out on anything. So how do you deal with it? Because I often see people in board meetings all of a sudden start looking at their shoes when Sneaky Stephen starts talking, because they know somebody's getting a bollocking and they just want to be out of the line of fire. So what do you do if Sneaky Stephen is bullying somebody and the chair doesn't seem to be able to deal with it?
Yeah, right. And you could use phrases that's like, this discussion may be getting confrontational. You can be more direct, right? Because this is getting out of hand. You could say more direct, have a more direct intervention and say things like this discussion maybe getting confrontational. You could say, Bob, I'm not sure what you're looking for. Can you give me some more context? And then we could also say something in the line of, can we take a minute to summarize? If it really gets really heated and you feel that there needs to be sort of somewhere in before a timeout, you could say, can we take a moment to summarize this? So everybody has a chance to have a more cooler heads to prevail, kind of a thing.
Good point. And then we finally get to level 3, and level 3 is a bully. There is no question they're a bully. They yell, they'll be calling people, they'll be saying rude things to people. So we've got a clear case of outward blatant incivility. How do we deal with that?
Yeah, so and that's where you draw the line. And you could say things to the effect of, may I draw our attention to our code of conduct, which obviously silences a lot of people. We need to maintain civility and respect. You could say that as well to stop that in the track. And if nothing works at that point, you could directly address the chair and say, may I suggest a 5-minute break?
Yeah, good point. And that is a way of temporarily calling a timeout. Obviously, you're going to continue the meeting after that, but during that 5-minute break, there's a number of things that you can do during that period of time, and sometimes that's really what's needed. Okay, let's talk about what you're actually dealing with in terms of your outcome delivery on site. These are all things that you would hope for the facilitator to do. Starting from the right and moving to the left, you want to make sure that they're neutral, that they're listening, that they're paraphrasing, they're asking open-ended questions. But as the CEO or the senior manager, if you are not the facilitator, you can help establish the outcomes at the beginning. So if you feel it's going to be better for you to kind of get that started and get it out of the way, those are areas where the CEO can actually do the support. You can't do those other 3 areas, but you can start with establishing what the outcomes are. Equally, you can help, as Asif has given you some phrases, how you can help keep things on time if it looks like we're going overtime or we're going down a rabbit hole. Managing through dissent. Remember, dissent is a good thing as long as civility is maintained. But rabbit holes are one of the biggest challenges that we have. It's a great topic. We're off on a tangent, and before you know it, we're not even close to the agenda. Asif, can you give us some tips? What do you do when there's a rabbit hole happening?
Yeah, and that's a good point. We have all seen, there's somebody who's trying to get into the weeds and it's so hard to get them out. So before it goes to that point, give it a short lead. Hear him out or hear that person out for a bit, and then acknowledge the importance of that conversation, and bring that back to where we started off from by saying that, we acknowledge, Steve, that's a great point. But we need to come back and discuss what we were already discussing. Maybe what we could do is we could put this in a parking lot, and this, you could also say something to the effect of, this warrants a more broad discussion. Why don't we put it in the parking lot for now and bring it forward at our next meeting? So that's one way of appeasing them and also carrying on with the discussion. The other thing is that you could do is to call on people by their name. Now that's a very good way of engaging people, because everybody likes when the name is being called out and they hear their name. So that's a great way of engagement. And you could address somebody by way of, hey Bob, that's a great comment. If there's anything more that you have to add to that, please let us know, or something to that effect. Note their special expertise and insight. Ditto. Trisha, your insight on this is really helpful. We really appreciate that. And lastly, praise their input, because as we know, these volunteers are working so hard, and they have a day job and yet working on committees and boards. Always praise them. That really goes a long way in that retention of your volunteers. Useful phrases, I would say, as I'm just going to summarize as we discussed them in our previous slides. Some of them that you could use is what I think I hear you saying. I want to be respectful of your time. We can hear you have a lot of passion for this. Can you clarify what you're looking for? I think we're getting off topic. Some other phrases you could use is, I feel our discussion is getting confrontational. I want to draw your attention to our code of conduct. Shut the door. Erin?
Thanks very much, Asif. Well, in summary, our final tip to you is, if you've got great support and you've got great training, you should have great facilitation. So keep in mind, when people rise to those roles, you want to make sure that you are there to support them, that they feel supported. And if you have the opportunity and the ability and the budget to be able to provide them with training, that's really helpful as well too. So if you want any help taking your volunteer leaders forward, you know where to find us. We'd be happy to chat with you about anything that you have in terms of your needs. So let's go quickly to Q&A. I know we have literally 1 minute before 1 here, but I do know we've already got some questions. So Kevin, would you like to share with us some of the questions we've got?
Definitely. This first question, Asif and Erin, if you want to take a crack at it, please do so. But to our participants as well, if you have any thoughts or experiences that you want to share, please just enter them into the chat and I'll share them with the group. So the question is, have others tried AI minute-taking options to improve the effectiveness of meetings?
Yeah, so as Kevin has suggested, if you've got any suggestions for the rest of your peers on this call, please type it in. There's 2 things I would say, and I just want to do this quickly here. It's definitely worth a try. Yes, we have done it, but invariably it needs substantial editing. So sometimes it can be a great way of just making sure you've got a backup, but don't assume that it's going to save you a ton of time. It just may save you on the accuracy front. And please do make sure that whatever you're using for your AI tool, that you have got privacy on it. You want to make sure that what you're feeding into that tool is not going into the public domain. That is definitely not what you want with your board meetings.
Thank you, Erin. Asif, did you have anything?
No, that's
okay.
No, that's enough.
All right. So thank you. So one suggestion from one of our participants, Otter AI.
Yeah, I do want to, I want to comment on that. Yes, I agree. It's a great tool. One thing you need to be careful of is, I have seen on board meetings, for example, and other meetings, you've got people that are using that tool and they are planning on recording the meeting. Keep in mind, it is not okay to record a meeting unless everybody has agreed to it. So if I'm ever chairing a meeting and all of a sudden I see someone's Otter AI has just kind of come into the meeting, I will always boot them out of the meeting. If we are recording it, everybody needs to know in advance and everybody needs to agree. So if you want to record the meeting as a participant, check with the chair, let them know what you want, and make sure that you've got everyone's agreement before you move ahead. What's our next question, Kevin?
So the next question is, how do you keep committee meetings simple and effective and free of governance heaviness?
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm not sure what you mean by governance heaviness. And obviously, you know, you can make committee meetings very formal. You could be using Robert's rules, but as a general rule of thumb, the governance things that I think are important for committee meetings are, just like a board meeting, make sure you've got an agenda and it's shared in advance and it's timed. Make sure that you've got meeting notes after the fact and you're tracking the tasks from them. And also make sure you're tracking attendance, because from a committee perspective, if you've got somebody that just isn't showing up, you need to know and you need to be able to share it with them and find out whether they really have the capacity to stay on the committee.
Yeah, and I just want to add to Erin's points to have, like, it's important to have a proper briefing material and send ahead of time so that the board members have enough time to read it.
Good point. What's our next one, Kevin?
So how do you balance being a staff support to a committee without bulldozing a volunteer chairperson?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And Asif addressed that earlier in the webinar, but basically, have a look at some of the phrases we noted in this presentation. Remember, you want to make sure that you're not taking over the chair role. So as much as possible, if you're going to interject, address your comments to the chair. Bob, maybe we want to call on Claire here. I know she's got a lot of information. Try to address your comments to the chair, not to the rest of the participants. And you try to use some of the phrases and come up with some of your own. What you're trying to do is to move things along, get yourself out of a hole, but without antagonizing people or making them feel like they've been shut down.
All right. Moving on to the next question. What are some of the best ways to keep committees or boards on track and on time with the agenda?
Yeah, I think the best way of dealing with that is having a timed agenda. So it's not only your start time and your end time, but you start at 4 and then at 4:05 this happens, at 4:10 this happens. Have those times right on there so the facilitator can be on top of it. And if the facilitator feels they need it, or you feel the facilitator needs it, make sure you've got someone who is the kind of the timer watchdog. You know, if it looks like the facilitator's kind of lost control of the time, make sure you've got somebody interjecting saying, I just want to be respectful of your time, or just having a look at the agenda, you know, that kind of stuff. Those would be my 2 suggestions, a really good agenda and a timer watchdog.
Any best practices for using Zoom for committees?
Yeah, I really feel strongly about this. Make sure that you've asked everybody to be on camera. I mean, that's the whole point of using Zoom. If you're going to make it a conference call with no camera, then do that. But there's no reason to have some people on camera, some people off, because it does really look like, it might not be true, but it looks like the people that are not on camera are not engaged. Now, I know the next thing you're going to say is, well, what if I'm driving? I don't want to be on camera. Of course, no, you don't. But you know what? You don't want to be driving when you're supposed to be participating in a committee meeting. If you're driving, you should be focusing on driving to keep yourself and everybody else on the road alive and healthy. If you're in a committee meeting, you want to be devoting your time to listening and being part of that committee meeting. And you can't do a good job of driving and being a good committee member at the same time. So all the way back to the camera. I think also with a virtual meeting, the facilitator has to make an extra effort to keep everyone engaged, because you can't easily read body language. So it takes more effort on the part of the facilitator. Using the raise your hand feature. In a virtual meeting, if people start talking over each other, it gets really, really hard to manage. So especially in a virtual meeting, I would suggest the raise your hand feature. I would also try to avoid screen sharing. One of the challenges with screen sharing, the facilitator, all of a sudden, the images of everybody gets really small, and it's even harder for the facilitator to read body language. So if you're going to screen share only for as long as you need to, and then shut off the screen sharing after that.
Great
Any
points.
more questions, Kevin?
Just a few more. Do you find it necessary as good governance to include legal issues as a standing board agenda item without any priors?
Okay, what I think I'm hearing here is that you are an association that has no particular reason to be focusing on legal issues. There's nothing going on right now. Is it a good idea to have that as a standing board item? I would say no. I mean, if you've got any legal issues, either impending, any risk management that you want to get out ahead of, absolutely you should be discussing those, not just when you have a problem, but when you want to get out ahead of a problem. But to have them as a standing agenda item, I don't see any need to do that. And I hope that, you know, as we evolve in Canada, that we don't find that we have to do that.
All right. So many association AGMs have been targeted by radical groups trying to disrupt or shut down meetings. Is there anything that associations can do to prepare for this, or any resources that are available?
Well, there's a couple of things to think about. First of all, your bylaws will define who can actually show up at a meeting. So if you've got people that are not members showing up at the meeting, then you can just be very clear at the beginning that it is restricted to members only, and non-members will not be welcome or let into the meeting. So that's one way that you can deal with it. You could end up in a situation where if you've got open membership, and I've seen this happen with charities before, where membership really means donor. You know, and you might have hundreds of members that you would never expect to show up at the AGM or expect to have a role in managing the charity, but anyone for $10 can buy a membership. And maybe you've got a situation where a radical group has decided, well, we're all going to spend $10 on membership so we can all be there and interrupt the meeting. So just be careful when you have your membership that there is a reason why it is membership, and that membership has to be accepted by the board in order for membership to go through. I've seen that happen more than once. So those are a couple of ways that you can deal with it. If they are legitimate members and for some reason they are radical, that's something you really want to address well before you get to the AGM. But if all of that has been done and there's nothing more you can do, then back to Asif's point about making sure that you've got very clear rules of engagement about the AGM and who gets the mic and when they get the mic, etc. And by the way, for any of you who are dealing with that, you've got my heartfelt empathy. That is such a challenging situation.
So last question is, how do you handle a board chair who wants to get in the weeds or into the nitty-gritty of operations matters, and lets discussion go off the rails under the guise of further understanding? So
okay, so yeah, this is a really good point, and it really depends on what the chair's motivation is. Is the chair's motivation that they want to go down that rabbit hole, or is the chair's motivation that they just don't want to cut somebody off? You know, I know this is Bob's pet hobby horse. It would be rude to cut Bob off. Really depends on what their motivation is. Training and briefing is really important. You need to make sure that you've trained your board chair. Look, we've only got a certain amount of time here. If you let this go off the rails, then everything after this agenda item doesn't get touched. So we can't do that. Give them some tools to say, okay, this is an important topic. I really feel we do need to discuss this. So for the minutes, can we please defer this? And we'll either have a special board meeting to discuss it on its own, or we will add it to the next board meeting. So have some phrases that they can use. Make sure that they are trained. Make sure you brief them ahead of time. You go through the agenda items and say, okay, we've got 10 minutes for this item. Make sure we don't go any longer. But think about what their motivation is. If they've got some pet hobby horses themselves that are making them want to kind of lead things down a rabbit hole, you may have to deal with that in a different manner.
All right, thank you, Erin and Asif. That's all the questions we had.
Well, thank you very much. It's been our pleasure to have you at the Zzeem webinar studio today. I just want to draw your attention to our next live webinar, which will be in the new year. Our first webinar of 2024 will be, as always, what's in store for the upcoming year. So please join us for that. That's when we pull out our crystal ball and try to give you some ideas about things you might want to be thinking about for the upcoming year. And for those of you who have attended, thank you. Kevin will be in touch with you to get your feedback. We always want to hear what kind of topics you want to hear about and what your questions are.